ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהכל נהיה בדברו. What is the importance of clothing for man, for woman? Animals don't wear any clothing. If you read the Bible, you can see that the first time the idea of clothing is mentioned is after the first man, Adam HaRishon, disobeys the word of God, and he's hiding in the Garden of Eden. Why are you hiding? God asks him. Because I'm naked. He's ashamed that he's naked. Who told you that you are naked? Maybe you ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. Well, Adam has to admit he did that. God then makes some clothing for him made out of fig leaves. This is why many people think in our tradition that the fruit that the first man ate when he disobeyed God was really a fig, not the famous apple that everybody quotes. But we don't know really what kind of fruit it was because the Bible does not specify it. But God makes him clothing. What is the word in Hebrew for clothing? Beged is a piece of clothing. But bogad, the same root, means to be a traitor. In any event, clothing hides something, just like a traitor who supposedly is loyal to you, but then he goes and sells the secrets to somebody else. He betrays you. So clothing, in a certain sense, betrays your eyes because you don't see what you are really seeing. Something is covering up that. There's another word in Hebrew, me'il, which means also like a tunic. It also comes from the same root as ma'al. It's subversive. It is not the right thing. In general, clothing isn't seen so with good eyes in the Torah. You know, Jacob had 12 sons. So he went and bought a special piece of clothing for one of them, Joseph, and that immediately created jealousy among the brothers. You see, once again, that clothing is no good. There's another story. Yehuda, one of the sons, has 3 sons himself, but 2 of them die. He has a daughter-in-law by the name of Tamar, and the third one does not marry her because there is a law in the Torah, and apparently was observed prior to the Torah also, that the brother of the deceased marries the widow, and thereby the children that are born bear the name of the deceased. Well, this lady Tamar goes and disguises herself as a prostitute. Again, clothing is something negative. King Saul doesn't obey the word of God. So the prophet Shmuel tells him, you know, lishmoa mizevach tov. It is more important to obey God than to bring sacrifices. And Saul, the first king, begs him, please don't go away from him. And he takes him by the tunic and he tears part of the clothing. So the prophet says, just like you tore this piece of cloth, so your kingdom shall be torn from you. So we see that begadim, beged, a piece of clothing, is not viewed very well by the Torah. Yet, when it comes to the high priest, something else. The Torah is very specific. What kind of tunics, what kind of pants, what does he have to wear? And there's a number of pieces of clothing that are enumerated. Not only that, we have a prohibition called do not mix wool and linen together. You cannot make a piece of clothing out of these 2 things. Wool and linen together. Prohibited. Why is it prohibited? We really don't know. It's called shatnez. Some say, you know, this really refers to the first family in the world. There was Adam and Eve, and they had 2 children, Hevel and Cain. Well, they actually divided the world among themselves. Cain became the farmer, everything that came from the earth, just like linen comes from the earth. That's a vegetable. And on the other hand, Hevel, Abel, was whatever was on top, and wool comes from an animal. So maybe you weren't supposed to mix the 2 because it was like a separation between 2 different kingdoms. What is below the earth and what is above it. One is for one son, one is for the other. And there was a lot of, you know, enmity between the 2. You know, Cain kills Abel. But in the case of the high priest, of the Kohen Gadol, this time there was no contradiction. There was no confrontation between what is above and what is below, because this was the function of the Kohen Gadol. He was supposed to bring heaven down to earth. He was a connection between what is earthly and what is celestial. So part of the clothing of the Kohen Gadol had this shatnez. This brings us to a moment of reflection. You know, these things in themselves aren't bad. It depends how one uses them. It's the confrontation between Cain and Abel that was bad. And the Kohen Gadol represented something altogether different. He represented harmony, peace, living together, respecting one another. He finished the blessing of the Jewish people, HaMevarech et Amo Yisrael Bashalom. The priestly blessing is God should give you peace. You should be one. Linen and wool should eventually be one, and shatnez that is prohibited now someday will somehow come together. So make sure when there are contradictions in your home, when there are contradictions in your daily life, maybe they are not so opposed one to the other. It depends how you use them. And maybe you can bring harmony into different points of view in your own family.